Welcome to the Pacific Research Institute's Next Round podcast. I'm Rowena Itchon, COO, and with me, as always, is Tim Anaya, Vice President of Marketing and Communications. So we have a very sobering podcast today. Our senior fellow in California Reform, Steve Smith, who is a former police officer, suggested that we interview family members whose relatives were victims of crime, and in this case, murder, only to see those who committed the crimes later released. So you'll hear from Carl Olson and Bob Spano, their very, very tragic story. And, we're think tanks here and we work with the data, we do the research, but nothing really hits home more than real stories of real victims.
That's right, Ro. And when you hear, the latest statistics on crime in California just came out, and we saw, and it really didn't get much bump in the press, but we saw that violent crime and property crime are both up 6.2% in California. And that's year over year. That's not over a long period of time. And so I know it did me, but what will infuriate you when you hear Carl and Bob's stories is that because of all of these very bad public safety policy mistakes that the state has made in recent years, victims like Carl's families and Bob's families are being re-victimized again because of bad changes in the law and executive actions that are, in their case, still very dangerous people by all accounts, before they have fully paid their debt to society. And in some cases, these may be people who shouldn't be released from prison ever. And so in the interview today, you will not only hear the stories of, what happened to their loved ones, but you'll also hear the really frustrating experiences that they've had with the parole boards. And in some cases, rogue prosecutors like a Chesa Boudin or a George Gascon or a Pamela Price, they're making it worse because of their really inaction in these cases. And then we'll talk through the policy and identify the policies that are causing these families to go through their grief again, and talk through really what should be done to make sure that inmates like these are not released early and that families aren't suffering again. So it's a really powerful, powerful episode. It's a little longer than our normal ones, but I think you'll be riveted to the discussion today.
But first, we've got a few announcements. For our Southern California supporters, we wanted to tell you about our next guest, John Yoo. John is a law professor at UC Berkeley, and many of you know him as Fox News contributor. He often talks about issues of the Supreme Court and other legal matters. And going back further, he was a Bush administration justice official who wrote the waterboarding memo as Deputy Assistant Attorney General. His new book is The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Supreme Court, part of Regnery's Politically Incorrect Guide. We call it the Pig series. And he's going to talk about that book, and we'll have the book available for his signing. The luncheon's at the Pacific Club on August 15th, and he's a terrific speaker, so we hope you can join us.
And if you haven't already, make sure you RSVP for our upcoming webinar with best-selling author Carol Roth, who will be talking about her new book, You Will Own Nothing. And we're going to go through ESG and a lot of these government overreach policies when it comes to the economy and dictating how you should spend your money, how you should invest, etc. It's going to be Wednesday, August 2nd at 11 a.m. Pacific time. And you can go to pacificresearch.org/events to sign up for both of these events.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us. Bob, Carl, and Steve, we're so pleased to have you as a guest on Next Round this week to talk about your unfathomable tragedies and the broken state parole system that's causing victims' families to relive traumatic memories. So first question for Steve. Steve Smith is our senior fellow at the Center for California Reform. So Steve, before we go into the cases, perhaps you could give us an overview of California's parole system, how it used to work before Prop 57 was enacted, and how this and other public policy mistakes have led to a seismic increase in the number of inmates being granted parole.
Will do. And thanks for that great question, Ro. Historically, and actually still currently, there's two ways out of prison. One is to have served a percentage of a determinate sentence that is fixed by law as either one of three, a mitigated, midterm, or aggravated sentence. Most of those are the midterm, and their release dates are set by the CDCR based on whether a prisoner has committed a violent or nonviolent crime. The other way out of prison is for those serving indeterminate sentence. For example, an inmate serving 25 to life. For them, the path to freedom is through the Board of Parole hearings, something most listeners would know as the parole board. In the past, determinately sentenced violent offender served 80% of their sentence, and nonviolent served 50%. Today, under Prop 57, violent offenders across the board can be released having served just 66% rather than the 80% that they served prior to Prop 57. In addition, a three-striker with a violent offense now qualifies for the shorter term. And of course, Prop 57 does not include human trafficking, domestic violence, and rape by means of an intoxicant as a violent crime. Other legislation has lowered the age for elderly parole from 60 if an inmate had served 25 years to just 50 if they have served just 20. Credit earning opportunities include avoiding disciplinary problems, achieving educational goals, participating in drug or alcohol treatment, or alternatives to violence programs. What's interesting and maybe ironic is that if a program is full, an inmate needs to just sign up for it in order to get a reduction in their sentence, whether or not they attended or completed it. Good conduct credits are available to all people in prison who are serving determinate and indeterminate sentences, including those in alternative custody settings outside of California, in state hospitals, or serving their sentence in federal prison. They can lose those credits if they violate prison rules, and in some cases, they can get them restored. For indeterminate prisoners, it moves up the date they're eligible for parole. For determinate sentence prisoners, it moves up their release date.
So, Bob and Carl, we understand that these are very emotional and painful memories for you, talking about your loved ones who are tragically murdered. So we're so pleased that you're willing to join us and share what happened, because our hope today is that some folks at the Capitol listen to these stories and maybe start to think about these issues and the consequences of these changes in the law. So let's start with a question for Bob. Bob, you tragically lost your aunt, who was murdered by a family friend back in the 1980s. So can you please share with our listeners what happened to her nearly 40 years ago now?
Well, good morning, Tim, and thanks for having me on the podcast this morning to share my story, to share my family story. Yeah, my Aunt Mary DeAugusta, who was my grandfather's sister, on December 10th, 1984, was murdered by a family acquaintance, a family friend. The family friend was Michael Leon Grant. He was a friend of my Aunt Mary's granddaughter, and he was also a handyman and had befriended my Aunt Mary, because my Aunt Mary was that kind of a person who would just open her door up to anyone. She was just a very loving and warm person. And so Michael Leon Grant, who, as I mentioned, was a handyman, he was doing some work at my Aunt Mary's house in San Francisco on December 10th, 1984. And while he was there, something happened to him, or he was in the process of pursuing this or premeditating this, which is what our family believes. But he made a pass at my Aunt Mary. My Aunt Mary denied that and said, what are you doing? And then he went into a rage and he killed her. He murdered her. He cut her throat. He hit her over the head with the fire tongs. He doused her with lighter fluid, and then he left the premises. And when my Aunt Mary was discovered and the police were called, all the evidence led to Michael Leon Grant, and he was subsequently, apprehended and arrested within 24 hours of the murder happening. And from that point had been incarcerated until he was released 1 year ago, actually, around today, because the parole board hearing was July 18th, 2022. So that's when the decision was made, around 1 year ago. And so he spent from basically the day after he committed the murder until August of 2022, when he was finally released, in prison for what was then a second-degree murder. And looking at the case over and over the years, because of all the letters I've written to the parole board, collectively the family does believe this was first-degree murder. And so that's the story of what happened to my Aunt Mary.
So, Carl, you tragically lost your sister who was strangled to death back in the 1990s by her husband. So please share with our listeners what happened to your sister nearly 30 years ago.
Oh, thanks for the question, Ralph. My sister Diane was in South San Francisco, and in 1996 she was 27 years old. And right before it happened, I'd seen her up here in Sacramento, California, and she dropped in. It was a weekend of her birthday, and I asked where Richard ended up being Richard James Ranta was her husband. And she said, well, we're kind of going through some issues, but I don't know. I think he wants to kill himself all the time. I just can't hold him up anymore. So we've always heard, I could just strangle him. Oh, I'd kill him if they left me. You never take it at that point. I was only 33, and we hadn't heard the stories yet of how, love or whatever, somebody leaving and being violent against women. We see it in the forefront now. But in 1996, it was catching us off guard. And we hadn't really heard much of Richard. Richard was someone that was 10 years older than her. He was the older brother of a sister that was her roommate. So he came out from Michigan and was sleeping on the couch. My sister allowed that. And next thing you know, they started dating. And then for a 4-year period, 2 years of before marriage and 2 years of marriage, they were husband and wife and living together. She was his breadwinner. She was always somebody that was taking care of him. Even though she was 10 years younger. She was top of her class in College of San Mateo. She was magna cum laude in San Francisco State. But we always felt that for some reason she was with Richard. She did have some personal issues with being a little bit heavy, but real pretty girl. But her self-esteem wasn't there, and so she was kind of prone to somebody like Richard, who ended up being a manipulator and kind of painted the rosy picture all the time. Well, the couple days before the murder, we heard he was having trouble. That's when my dad had called over there because they were going to break up. And little did we know that, the night that my dad talked to him and they were discussing Mother's Day, that my mom would have 2 police officers the next morning take her out of a classroom she was working at to tell her that her daughter was murdered. That's when our world changed. And luckily, I think we're going to get to it more here about the San Mateo DA took over, but he murdered her in their bed in South San Francisco. Police responded to emergency calls and dispatch that went from him after he did it back to Michigan and to a brother and a sister who then called back to San Francisco and South City, and they had a mix up in the city, so it took a little bit time for 911 to respond, but they were able to then kick the door down, get in, find him taking pills. They brought him to the hospital and read him his rights about 3 days later when he did admit that he did it, or at least he said that I'm going to let the system take care of me to people around him. So that started our world when he murdered her in 1996.
So you would expect that individuals who committed such heinous crimes and who received 25 to life sentences would serve the rest of their days behind bars, or certainly be locked up for decades. But for Bob and Carl, in both of your cases, you've seen both individuals who murdered your loved ones granted parole within the last year, which certainly has angered and frustrated you and your family members. Could each of you share a little bit about what happened and what you observed and experienced in the parole hearings? Let's start with Bob.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did mention in my answering the first question that parole hearing was around a year ago. I have the notes in front of me. It was July 18th, 2022. And leading up to that parole hearing, I had been receiving some correspondence from Department of Corrections on the fact that this was coming up, that the governor was denying his parole, but it was now going for an in-bank referral to the parole board, and his fate was going to be decided by the parole board. It was taken out of the governor's hands. And so this was all new to us. We were learning this. And I should add a point of clarification to this. And my family, the champion for this cause over the years was my Aunt Mary's daughter, Anna Pavarello. And she was the one that was always sending out the letters and letting everybody know about the dates for parole hearings and everything. cousin Anna has since passed away. So the rest of the family stepped up, and her daughters, my Aunt Mary's granddaughters, also stepped up, and her son as well, and all continued the process of soliciting the parole board, to stop this. Well, at this particular one, we still did that. I showed up to the actual in-person parole board hearing in Sacramento, and there was others that came in on Zoom. The rest of the family came in on Zoom. My mom also read a statement, and my mom's at the time had just turned 80 years old, and my Aunt Mary was 74 when she was murdered. So my mom's perception of this was, here's the person that killed an elderly woman, in 1984. Here's my mom now, an elderly woman in present day, and this person is now being paroled 20 minutes. He's going to live 20 minutes from where she lived. So it was unfathomable that this was actually going to potentially happen. So we read our statements at that parole board hearing. Like I mentioned, I came to the parole board hearing in person. He was number 17 on the agenda of about 20 people. So I sat through all 16 of the other hearings of all the heinous things that people had done, and hearing what all the survivors and victims statements that were read back. And it was pretty overwhelming that day for me. I mean, as I got closer and closer to my turn to stand up and read my statement, I was almost to the point where I couldn't do it. It was like bringing me back in time, and I did a year in Baghdad in Iraq in 2006 to 7. So I would like to think that, I could handle things like that. But come to find out that, these things, they really never leave you. So I read my statement. Like I mentioned, my mom read her statement. My cousins on Zoom read their statements, which were extremely powerful because they had the history of it. And that was that. And then after that hearing was completed, then we waited to find out what the results were. And shortly thereafter, we got the notification that the parole board decided to release him. And they pretty much released, out of the 20, they almost released everybody that day, including some really, really multiple murder criminals that are out on the streets now, including, the person that did this to my aunt. So he's out now, and he's living in San Francisco, just like we all feared. So that was my experience of going through the parole hearing process.
Carl?
Yeah, that's terrible to hear that whole situation, Bob. Ours was a little bit more by the old book, I would say, because we got lucky that Richard did do 85%. So we were getting up to 20 years out of a 25 to life sentence, murder one. And so we were first scheduled for his eligible date was 2016. We saw that for years. We knew we were shooting toward it. My parents were getting older. We were deciding what we were going to be able to do, how we could go protest it, how we can have some impact toward it. And in Soledad, where he was in August of 2017, he did have a parole hearing. But through the San Mateo DA, they gave us prior warning. They knew it was happening. I was able to get to an assistant DA ahead of time, and I brought my mother down to discuss things ahead of time so we wouldn't be caught off guard that day, because we were going to physically be at the prison. And they allowed one visitor. My ex was there, and my parents. So we were preparing for it. In the meanwhile, my mom was a member of Parents of Murdered Children, the group you never want to be joining. But they told her of their timing and how it always seemed to help to have somebody sitting there. And my mom and dad, of course, were not going to miss this. So we got prepared, and we did a letter writing campaign. It just had all the impact statements set up. And I would tell the listeners that anyone that's going up against that is that it all counts a little bit, or did in our time. So that first time showed up because Richard was already 20 years into it. And they said he was checking the boxes. He was going to the anger management classes. He was going to study for his pastor license with religion, whatever we thought he was doing. But he showed up and really was trying to do all the things that they were supposed to do. But that morning, armed with the other thing I was going to talk about is the prosecutor's statement that was done at the time with the probation report. Because even back in 96, the probation report was very tilted tilted toward Richard. Like it just, when you reread it, it's amazing how much they kind of lean toward that person. So our prosecutor said, I'm going to put in the file a rebuttal to that and give you the facts of the case more. In other words, bring people back 20 years, when it's 20 years out in the future, to that night, that day, and that trial. So because it's only going to pad up his file with things he's done well, because he's listened to people, he's done a class. His file gets thick on little simple things that come at him in prison. Yet at the same time, nobody's talking about the past. So we were armed with that. The DA did not have that 20 years later. He was glad to see it all again. And we ended up able, with a 4-hour parole hearing, sitting in the room. He never looked over at my parents, never addressed me. And the commissioners, although they were very well read on his case, they were well read on what he was doing up. He did have some more women issues. He had issues with guards, women guards. He was still following the pattern of abuse toward a woman, let alone killing one and strangling one. So just by him going off on a couple women guards in the past was enough, with his other descriptions, got him to do 5 years. So our first parole gave a 5-year denial, which we were prepped to say maybe a year, maybe the 3 years, but 5 was very different. So we thought we were okay for 5 years. He petitioned a little bit earlier for his second one and got granted again. So we were also talking with the system, but now you're talking 2020 and 2021, which I'm now learning are the times when this system is changing on us. And it started really trying to open the door for him. But we got a second parole in 2020 with a Zoom call where he was from the prison, and we went down to the San Mateo DA, which again was very good for us. They sat us in meetings so that my parents could deal with the Zoom call in that environment with the police close and the DA close to us, not just sitting in a home somewhere. So they ended up doing well again because he talked himself into another 5 years. They were not releasing him. So they were seeing something in prison that they didn't believe he should be out for. And we were always surprised at what he was doing in there, what he could do, because sitting in a meeting, he sounds very calm and he's very good and he's all yes, sir, no, sir. But he goes off when he's put in bad positions with, again, positions of authority or below him with women. And with me too, we thought, how is Newsom or somebody going to really let people out when we were worrying about people putting their hands on butts and photos, that you're going to talk and let a guy out that actually was physically strangling and has shown that type of attitude toward women since? And then what we'll be getting to about the COVID release and the compassionate release, he's in the same situation. It wasn't a shooting. He's a violent guy to someone sitting around him. But we were happy that we got a 5 years and then a 5 years, but then he got let out. But that was our story at the time. We were very happy with San Mateo DA.
Thanks for that, Carl. So this is a question for Steve. Before Prop 57 and other policy changes and executive actions were taken, it would have been unimaginable that these two individuals would have been granted parole. Steve, explain to our listeners how these public policy mistakes led to parole being granted in these two cases and is leading to parole being granted in many other cases like this.
Prop 57, AB 3234, the increase in good time earning credit opportunities for inmates, as well as the out and out gifting of credits by the governor during COVID, is now being extended to murderers and other violent offenders. Again, with the exception of people serving life without parole and people under sentence of death. That's not what voters who voted for Prop 57 understood would happen, but a 3-judge panel of the California Court of Appeals, in listening to challenges by the CDAA, the California District Attorneys Association, ruled that the intent of the language of Prop 57 meant that all inmates inside the system could be somehow eligible for early release. So, Carl mentioned these time intervals. I'll give you an example. Somebody prior to Prop 57 with a current murder offense on their record would have to serve 100% of their sentence. Immediately after Prop 57, that reduced to 80%. And then after May 1st, 2021, when the 3-judge panel ruled, they now only have to serve 66% of their sentence before they're parole eligible. So back in the day when Carl and Bob's relatives were killed, the parole board wasn't really releasing people. So plea bargaining a case to 25 to life meant it would probably be life. And I'll give you an example. In 1995, 2,128 inmates were eligible for parole through the parole board, and only 8 were granted. Fast forward to 2021, when both of their murderers were released, 8,722 hearings occurred and 1,424 received affirmative decisions and were released by the parole board. That's a fantastic increase, and one that no prosecutor could have possibly dreamed would ever happen, and no family, who were certainly consulted back then because the Victims' Bill of Rights allowed for that, could have predicted that they would ever be released. But that's exactly what has happened.
Kind of picking up on that point, who is elected as district attorney in the county where the crimes took place can be a very big factor in these cases. Bob and Carl, you've touched on it a little bit in your previous answers, but could you talk a little bit more about the role the San Mateo County District Attorney's Office played in your family's cases? Let's start with Carl this time.
In our situation, San Mateo, again in 1996, and South San Francisco, we couldn't be happier. They actually had a DA that took the case, was really good. He was a constitutional teacher. We could tell he was going to be really good with the jury. And they spent the resources. We found out later, again, through Parents of Murdered Children and Compassionate Friends, that my parents and us were dealing with kind of a rare situation with the prosecution at the time, because South San Francisco sent 2 police officers out to Flat Rock, Michigan, where Richard was from, for background. San Mateo put up witnesses with hotels. They also went into jails to get jail statements that he had made. They did things to impeach his side of the witness stand people. They did a lot for us with money-wise. And again, they brought out 3 or 4 witnesses from Michigan, which were his family members, who we were just amazed and grateful that they came to trial and repeated what they had said a year before, which was, yes, he did admit that he killed her. Nowadays, and you watch it on TV all the time, it's, I can't recall, and then that's fuzzy. And they actually came out and said, we lost our daughter-in-law, your sister, but we also lost our son. So they said we had to come out and do what we were going to do, and then they went back. So he didn't really had nobody out on his side except for a psychiatrist, and that's when we found out he had a history back in Michigan of violent situations with police, a lot of suicidal ideation, a lot of things and violence in the trailer park, that he broke out windows, things that we hadn't heard of. In fact, when the 2 police officers went out into Michigan, they found the 2 earlier wives and a 3rd girlfriend that every one of them said, when they approached and said, we're from South San Francisco and San Mateo County, do you know Richard Ranta? And they would say, well, I don't think he did it to me, but he could have. I could have been that next woman. Kind of like the movie Falling Down, where with Michael Douglas, they're not too sure. He hasn't quite reached out yet enough for them to leave, but they know it's there. That was probably my sister with Richard. She just didn't expect it, didn't know it. But they sent the resources on that. And again, we were very grateful with the DA. And then later on with the parole, they did keep track. They did, like I said in the previous answer, they did send somebody up who happened to be the assistant DA at the time when he was new. And 20 years later, he's now the full deputy DA in San Mateo. And he took the case, and we were just glad that they were there. Again, from San Mateo County's point of view, they backed us for 2 parole denials. It was the system lately that has swung the door on the technicality. So that's what's frustrating toward the end here, how it's changed since we were doing it the right way and getting it done the right way from San Mateo County. And then their hands were tied when this release happened.
Bob?
Yeah, so in my case, it was the San Francisco district attorney that we had to deal with. And back in 1984 when this happened, and for the what he eventually was convicted of and then sentenced, he pretty much, under the second degree murder charge that he was eventually convicted of, pretty much got the maximum at the time. And the family felt that the DA was handling it with the best interest of the family, to get the maximum punishment for the perpetrator. In my family's case, like I said, this was in 1984. I'm not going to get into this whole story, but just in 1970, we had another murder happen in our family. It was my dad's sister that happened in 1970 in San Francisco. And at that time, the San Francisco DA was completely botching the cases. And in that case, justice was not served. So we were going into that with the wonderment of what was going to happen in 1984. And like I mentioned, it was handled in the best interest of the family, where, in this case, Michael Leon Grant got the maximum penalty. But who knew all these years later, as the statistics that Steve pointed out, from back when the first statistic was quoted on the number of parolees that were released, which was 8, compared to over 1,000, just recently. And we got caught up in that way. And so, fast forward to now, when we're dealing with the San Francisco district attorney, and Steve pointed out another thing where they don't have any representation for their survivors, for the families, or for the victims. But they sure as heck did send somebody from Chesa Boudin's office to his final parole hearing to advocate for his release. Saying that he served his time, and according to what she had seen on paper, was eligible for parole because of whatever interpretation she saw fit. She was basically went to that meeting with the intent to articulate that this person needed to be released. And once again, our family was sitting there with no representation or anybody giving us any guidance or telling us anything other than, oh, so sorry. And even to the point where, he wasn't supposed to be released back to the same city he committed the crime, which is exactly what happened. So now we're in the process of working through the system to see if we can influence that, of maybe having him move into a different part of the state. So we're keeping track of all that as well. At the time, in 84, he ended up spending 40 years. So whatever conviction he got, it did stick for 40 years. So in 1984, district attorney folks we dealt with seem to have gotten it right. It's fast forwarding to the 2022 district attorney team, and they seem to want to undo everything. And that's what my family has dealt with.
So, Steve, talk about how rogue district attorneys like George Gascon in Los Angeles, for example, are adding insult to injury with their actions, or really lack thereof, in these parole cases.
Some DAs, George Gascon in Los Angeles, Chesa Boudin in San Francisco, who now, of course, is recalled and is a law professor at Berkeley, as well as Pamela Price over in Alameda County, do not send their prosecutors to assist families in parole hearings. Further, they don't make the proactive step of notifying families of upcoming parole hearings. LA County alone is the number one county in terms of number of prisoners incarcerated, and is also the number one county in terms of prisoners released early. And statistics show that families that are supported by district attorneys' offices who show up to parole board hearings have a higher success rate of fighting parole than those who don't.
So let's turn to the policy. In recent days, the Assembly Public Safety Committee initially blocked legislation to increase penalties in human trafficking cases because they were more concerned about locking up human traffickers for life than fighting for victims. Of course, these same committees routinely pass the kind of policy mistakes that cause new pain for Bob and Carl's families and block reasonable reform to fix these problems. So this is a question for Steve. Steve, based on your research in your Paradise Law study and in talking with Bob and Carl, what should be the priority for lawmakers to put an end to what Bob and Carl's families have experienced?
Well, I think what we need is a return to a victim-centered orientation in the criminal justice system rather than the offender orientation that we have seemed to have drifted in over the last 10 years. The number one priority should be public safety and preventing victimization. Yet it seems now the only victims out there are the so-called victims of what many consider to be an unjust system or one that is racially biased. Ironically, the CDCR in April of this year, California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, concluded its own study of the first cohort of inmates released under Prop 57, and it showed that over 60% were rearrested by year 3 of their release, which is the traditional period of parole, 3 years. That's only a couple percentage points less than the pre-Prop 57 recidivism rates. And this tells me that the rehabilitation programs aren't working, something that was promised when the voters were presented with the choice of Prop 57. Another indicator that the programs are not working is the increase in crime rates over the last several years. Just last year alone, there was an over 6% increase in property crimes and a 6.2% increase in violent crimes. In the case of violent offenders, especially, incarceration works. It works by ensuring that violent offenders remain in prison unless they can show they are no longer a risk. And with a 60% recidivism rate, it tells me that the people they're releasing continue to be a risk. It also sends a message to those considering committing a violent offense that they will face a lengthy prison sentence should they cross that line. Incarcerating violent offenders will not overcrowd our prisons if criminals are deterred. 3 strikes prove that. In the first year after passage in 1994, the rate of increase in the prison population actually dropped from 190% prior to the passage of 3 strikes to just 30% after the passage of 3 strikes. And even today, less than 10,000 inmates in the system are 3 strikers. So they're certainly not the cause of overcrowding that the proponents of the mass incarceration argument are making. There's room for violent offenders in prison, and in my opinion, many of them should remain there.
So, Steve, we saw that public outrage was able to force the Assembly Public Safety Committee to reverse course and ultimately take another vote to pass the human trafficking bill. So, can history repeat itself here? Are there any measures that have been introduced this session that would make progress in fixing the problem? Ultimately, what will it take to get lawmakers and Governor Newsom to do the right thing here?
Well, I think, we're all waiting for that tipping point. Back in the mid-90s, it was the tragic case of Polly Klaas being kidnapped and murdered by Richard Allen Davis, who was a parolee and had been released early under the laws that existed at that time. So it's clear that public outrage can have an effect on policy. And I think in the case of the child sex trafficking bill in the Assembly Public Safety Committee, the high amount of bad press and public outrage had an effect. It forced the Public Safety Committee to bring that back to them, and when reevaluated, received the votes that it needed, a 6-2 vote with 2 Democrats abstaining to advance to the Appropriations Committee, which will happen, after their current recess. So yes, I think even in a highly slanted, partisan legislature that we have, with a Democratic supermajority, that public safety can win out if people are informed and react in a robust way.
So this is a final question for Bob and Carl. As we close, let's give Bob and Carl the last word. What's your message to lawmakers? What would you like to see them do to make sure that what happened to you and your families doesn't happen again? Let's start with Bob.
Well, once again, thanks for hosting this and allowing us to share our stories. I think that so much of what Steve said and what he's published in Paradise Lost is really what I would like to see change, because you end up re-victimizing the survivors and the victims, and without doing that, and what we're currently experiencing right now. And I don't want any other family to have to go through this. With the fear, like I had mentioned when I was speaking earlier, of now the murderer in this case is literally sleeping 20 minutes away from where my mom and dad live, and not in prison, in wherever that is in San Francisco. And so that to me is completely unacceptable. There's no consideration at all for the victims and the survivor in this case, because that shouldn't take place. Even if the person's going to be released, logic would tell you at least put them in, we're a big state. You can put them 400 miles away somewhere else. A lot of different places, a lot of different ways that could have been handled. So I think by bringing attention to, these stories, you can kind of see from just hearing it, what we're feeling and what we think, why we're sharing it and how it could be avoided in the future for other families. And it's really just kind of going back to the way things were in many ways, with separating out the prison population from the violent and the nonviolent, and focus on the violent and keep the violent incarcerated.
Carl?
Yes, thanks for having me too. It's been a long road through this 25 years going on 30, but to watch it unravel toward the end is kind of, I guess, my point to lawmakers. Compassionate release, when I first went to look it up, when we found out that Richard was going to be trying to do that, on paper, it made sense. They were talking about people that could be, I was literally saying, in a coma, 24-hour care, brain death, a persistent vegetative state. It said ventilator dependency. And I said, okay, that's when I guess you send them home. But there was a structure that was then to put them into they were going to have a step where they get approved to go out to a hospital or a similar private quasi-government care home. They still weren't going to be released to the public. They were still in the system, and they were trying to find a budgetary way to do that. But even as Richard came up to his denial in September of 2022, that's when we found out that Newsom had signed another law because their apparent compassionate 1170E wasn't being used enough. So they lowered the bar again to where now you're reading, it doesn't say 12 months of expected life. It was 6 months before. Now it's 12 months. And 12 months with a cancer or some other type of guess, as we've been lucky enough and then to know people that were giving, 12 months to live, and luckily have gone 7, 8, 9 years later, if not longer. So this guess that 12 months is the new standard, and that instead of coma and 24-hour care, I believe I read it said it wasn't high blood pressure, but it was diabetes, the first diabetes, things that at 60 years old, we probably all register those things. So I'm like, how are we really going to let prisoners out at 60 years old now, as Steve had mentioned in his writings, down to 50? And I would make the point that to legislators that this idea that it's a 60-year-old and 25 years in at the time, it still put a 35-year-old that was a murderer. In my case, Richard was 37 years old. And that when they're 37, that isn't a 19-year-old or 21-year-old. That's an adult that has gone through life, gone through his ups and downs. He hasn't dealt with his situation. And that's an adult that's still thinking the same way at 37 that they do at 60. And I can't believe that it go down from 50 with 20 years to make a 30-year-old be that. 30 years old, at this point, you could murder somebody in California and put in your 20-year career and then get out at 50 and start a new life, like a lot of people do with 20-year careers in military and law enforcement. I just can't believe they're going to keep dropping the bar. If it's wasn't needed, or I get if it's an ambulance situation or they're getting close to it, but then I would move one step forward as they have to decide. Maybe we've had CYA facilities before, the youth authority facilities. We have a tiered system currently with 1, 2s, and 3s in the prisons with maximum security and minimum security. I would propose to them to get a situation where maybe these people that are getting close enough to be older just get even more, not minimum, but more medically helped. And if they're quote not a threat to society, then let them kind of still serve out behind the system's walls. The idea that they get to serve and go out to what they said dignity in bed, that's what I actually read. They in Los Angeles, they were getting on a judge because he said that they needed to stay in prison, and their rebuttal was that they should have dignity in bed and be able to sit around with loved ones. And that's when my parents and us say, you got to be kidding. Who had the dignity in bed when my sister was in bed? Where were my loved ones are all still fighting for her at this point. We didn't get to sit around the bed and give the dignity to the murderer that they would like to give now. So I just hope it gets put back to the 3 strike situation. Stuff that I read with Steve is very informative about the past. I think we did lower rates, incarceration rates, but to open up the door, the society just doesn't understand what they're doing to the public, and we were living it. So thanks for having me today, and appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much, Carl and Bob, and for sharing your tragic story. And for those who are listeners who are interested in learning more about Steve Smith's study, Paradise Lost, which offers policy reforms so that no family will have to go through what Bob and Carl's family went through. So thanks again, and thanks all for listening. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and Spotify. And when you're on these platforms, don't forget to give us a big 5 stars. If you don't subscribe to any of these, you can still listen on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Itchon. Hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.